Good morning, everyone. So this morning we are going to be talking about a helicopter named the Alouette 3, which was first produced by Sud Aviation, then by Aerospatiale, and we are going to go on a short journey from production in Toulouse to the Rhodesian Bush War. And I'll be telling you more about the Rhodesian Bush War as we go on. So our first slide, on the left, you will see a gentleman named René Mouille. In the middle, you will see Charles Marchetti, and pilot of the helicopter is Jean Boulet. So the history of this helicopter starts with the merger of two French companies. You can see them here. Société Nationale des Constructions Aéronautiques du Sud-Est, and then we have the Construction Aéronautique du Sud-Ouest, Société Nationale des Constructions Aéronautiques du Sud-Ouest. So this becomes Sud Aviation in 1957. But about 3 or 4 years earlier, it was these two gentlemen, so Charles Marchetti and René Mouille, who started working on the development of a helicopter called the Alouette 2. Now, the Alouette 2 has an interesting story, as it was to become the world's first mass-produced turbo helicopter. Now, although plans had been made to construct the helicopter, the change came in 1956 when Charles Marchetti visited a factory called Turbomeca. It's now Safran, which is in Bourdes in southwestern France. So we're talking about 150 kilometers southwest of Toulouse. Now, what was interesting about Turbomeca at the time was that they were producing engines called the Artust. The first one you can see here is the Artust 2C, Artust 2C. Which was a 400 shaft horsepower engine, offering a much greater speed and stability than radial engines. Now, just from a technical point of view, let's look at what we mean here by radial engines. That means it is an engine that you will see on top of a helicopter. This is the part which is concerned. So this in question is the radial part. If you can see on top of the helicopter, this is the radial part. And towards the back of the cabin, you have the turbo engine. Now, there are a lot of advantages over using a turbo shaft engine. And that is that it provides, first of all, greater stability, and also produces much more power. So this is important when flying in windy conditions or when the weather conditions don't permit easy flying. So it's much easier to control a turbo-powered engine, or a helicopter with a turbo-powered engine. Now, it was pretty successful, the Alouette 2. As we can see, piloted again by Jean Boulet. What it did was it set a new world altitude record for a light helicopter. We are talking about a light utility helicopter, an LUH. And this LUH reached a height of 26,925 feet. Just to put this into perspective, this is just over 2,000 feet lower than the peak of Mount Everest. So we can see that this was quite a feat for the time, only 3 years after man had first reached the peak of Mount Everest himself. So it's such a success that the Alouette 2 then went into mass production. The first people to order it was the French Fleet Air Arm Service, Aéronaval, that ordered 363 examples. Other orders then came from the French Air Force and the French Army, and it was quickly integrated into their services. Another advantage, apart from the rapidity, the rapidity and or the speed and the stability of the aircraft, is that it can be fitted with anti-tank missiles, machine guns, homing torpedoes, so it can be used in not only on ground warfare, or it can also be used in at sea for anti-submarine warfare. So it presented a lot of advantages for the services that acquired it. Now, when the merger took place and the company became Sud Aviation, there were major improvements which were carried out on the Alouette 2. So we have a third generation which was created, and this was the Alouette 3, which made its first appearance at Bourget Airport in February 1959. What was different is that it featured a much larger 6-passenger cabin. Its height was increased, and again, it was much faster than its predecessor. And this was due to the engine being changed, being updated. It now used an Artus 3B. Which gave it capability of climbing at a rate of 4.3 meters per second, cruising comfortably at a height of 3,200 meters over 504 kilometers, and being able to obtain a maximum speed of 210 kilometers. Now, as we can see, again from the photo, this was predominantly used in military situations in the beginning, as well as being used by French forces in the Algerian War. The Alouette 3 and the Alouette 2 were to become common features of what we call small wars in Africa in the 1960s. The one we can see here is being used by Portuguese forces in the Angolan War of Independence, also used in Mozambique. Portugal had 3 wars going on at the time. Angola started in the Angolan War started in 1961, as did Mozambique. And the Alouette 3 was used as a transport helicopter, transporting goods, transporting men. We know also that it was used in the what was called the Congo Crisis, excuse me, which is 1960 to 1967. And here we can see an Alouette 3 of the Force Aérienne Congolaise. So the Congo Crisis was another small war in neighboring Democratic Republic of the Congo, neighboring Angola. Came in very useful again for similar purposes as it was used in Angola. And what I want to explain to you is why the Alouette became so widely used. Just before we move on, you can see a photo here of an Alouette, an armed Alouette. What we see, I believe it's Rhodesian forces here, and the gun they're using is again a French-made Matra twin 20-meter Callan machine gun. Now, so why did the helicopter become such an important part of small wars? Well, let's just define a little bit of terminology here. When we say small wars, we are opposing this to what we call conventional warfare. Irregular warfare is another name for small wars. Now, conventional warfare generally opposes 2 forces of similar size. So if we want to give an example of conventional warfare, we were looking at the First World War or the Second World War. On the other hand, when we are looking at irregular warfare, we are talking about forces of different sizes being opposed. Another term for this is asymmetric warfare. Now, after 1945, there was an increase in the number of small wars involving irregular warfare, and this was due to the fact that we had a lot of nationalist movements which were created trying to force the issue on national independence in Asia, Malaya, for example, in Africa. The Algerian War was a small war. This was irregular warfare involving insurgent movements. So you have an insurgency being fought by what we call counterinsurgents. So the insurgents on one side are going to be much smaller than the regular forces. If we took Algeria, for example, the insurgent forces would be the FLN, and the national forces, the much larger forces, would be the French regular forces. So, in irregular warfare, because one side's forces tend to be much smaller than the others, they're going to have to use different tactics. We call these, from a general point of view, guerrilla tactics. These are tactics which were developed from the 1920s by Mao Zedong in China, something which he used against the Japanese in the 1930s, and again in the Chinese Civil War of the 1940s against Chiang Kai-shek nationalist forces. Now, generally, what it involves is these insurgent tactics involve, first of all, creating small forces, small units, operating in different geographical areas. Their objectives, first of all, are to recruit local populations through one means or another. Then, once they have grown in sufficient force, they will carry out small-scale attacks on military outposts, small-scale military outposts. They will seek to capture weapons, and then they will seek to build forces so that they can move on to larger targets. These can be smaller towns, villages. Eventually, of course, the objective is to take over the whole country and attack the central power, the central government. Now, obviously, the tactics which would be used by counterinsurgents are finding ways of limiting the insurgents' activities. That means stopping them as soon as possible. They have to, if we look at the phases of insurgency, so it would be to stop an insurgent attacking the small outposts, making sure those outposts are well protected. And if those outposts are attacked, it means getting to them rapidly, being able to defeat insurgents so that the rebellion, insurgency cannot spread. So we'll move on to our next slide, and we're going to be looking at the case of Rhodesia. Now, just to situate this geographically, Zimbabwe, if we look at the center of the map that we have on the screen, Zimbabwe is the new name, this from 1980, for Rhodesia. Now, let's just talk about Rhodesia briefly. This was firstly called Southern Rhodesia. It was colonized by the British in the 19th century. It gradually grew into one of the most prosperous countries in Africa, producing agricultural crops mainly, once known as the breadbasket of Africa. Again, an extremely prosperous country. Unlike South Africa, there was no racial division. People often see it as a racialist country, but there was no apartheid in Rhodesia. Now, In the 1940s, with the creation of the United Nations, the objective was to provide countries which were what we call non-self-governing. These are non-self-governing countries. That means that they weren't independent. They were ruled by what were seen as foreign powers. Well, the United Nations, with Article 11 of its charter, said that these countries should be given the opportunity to self-govern, should become independent. And although there was some opposition to these articles, to the resolutions, many countries did become independent. India gained its independence from Great Britain in 1947. There were other movements again in Africa. Ghana became independent in 1957. This became the first sub-Saharan country to gain its independence. Then France started to grant independence to its colonies. Belgium too, with the Belgian Congo. Now, there were two countries which didn't like the idea of installing what we call majority rule. Well, first one was Portugal, as we've seen, and the second one was Southern Rhodesia. Now, in order to get around British pressure, this is pressure from the British government being put on Southern Rhodesia, what the Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia did at the time, Ian Smith, declared what we call a unilateral independence. That means he just said, right, we're independent from now on. This happened on 11th of November, 1965. And of course, the date, the 11th of November, is very important as it corresponds with the armistice of 1918. Now, as we can see, Zimbabwe is surrounded by a number of countries. To the right on the map of Rhodesia, we have Mozambique. To the south, we have South Africa. We have Botswana to the left. We have a certain border with Namibia. And then we have Zambia, which used to be Northern Rhodesia, up to the left. Now, there had been, excuse me, there had been a movement to try and force independence, or try and force the white majority government to give up its power, which started in around 1964. As with many of the insurgencies in sub-Saharan Africa at the time, these were communist-backed insurgencies. When we say they were communist-backed, that means that the Soviet bloc or the People's Republic of China would provide funding, would provide military advisors, would provide weapons. Not just the Soviet bloc, but countries which were friendly to the Soviet bloc. So you would have Algeria, for example, who would be supplying weapons, Czechoslovakia, etc. Now, the names of these two movements. Well, first of all, we have the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, or ZANLA, and then we have the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, or ZIPRA. They're going to start mounting small-scale attacks. The insurgency hasn't yet reached anything near its full height, and won't do until 1974. So the Rhodesian forces are very able, very capable, and they're able to repulse the insurgencies, any attacks on military outposts that are being made. So not much progress is being made by the insurgent movements up until 1974. Now, in 1974, things are going to change. Portugal, which has been fighting these wars in Angola and Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau as well, Equatorial Guinea, excuse me, has been struggling to contain the insurgencies. And of course, in Portugal, we have the Carnation Revolution, end of April 1974, which is going to put an end to all Portuguese ambitions in its colonies. Now, what does this do? Well, this means that Zanla and Zipra, once Mozambique has been cleared of Portuguese presence, they are going to be able to use the surrounding countries as bases from which they can make incursions. And we can see that Mozambique is one of the main areas where the insurgent forces will seek to infiltrate, but also from Zambia and surrounding countries. So the Rhodesian forces had quite a lot on their hands. They only had around 42,800 members of the security forces, and those members had to cover a distance of some 400,000 square kilometers. Right, let's think about how the Rhodesian forces began to fight against this increased threat from 1974. Well, as we can see, what from the poster already, be a man amongst men. Well, what the Rhodesian government did is that it decided it would advertise in the United States, Great Britain, Australia, mainly Commonwealth countries, and that it would try to recruit men into its armies. These weren't mercenaries. They were men which became part of the Rhodesian forces. And so one way in which they were able to bolster their forces was through this recruitment. Secondly, there was a slight problem, which was in 1966, in the face of Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence, the United Nations Security Council had slapped on an arms embargo, which meant that Rhodesia was unable to acquire weapons easily. It had to go through other means. But fortunately for Rhodesia, there were a number of countries which supported its cause and which were ready to supply weapons. There were weapons mainly, I say mainly, a lot came from South Africa, including the Alouette helicopters that we're going to see in a moment. It provided a number of the 50 helicopters, the 50 Alouette helicopters that Rhodesia possessed at the time. There was also British military hardware, American hardware, Italian. So all in all, the Rhodesians were able to get hold of weapons and aircraft, albeit through irregular channels, not generally through the normal legal channels. Now, we need to just take a quick look at the Rhodesian military forces which were available at the time. Again, I think I said that this was highly professional units of soldiers. These were men who had been either in British forces, or some of them had been in the Vietnam War as well. Those who came from that served abroad came into the Rhodesian army. They'd been in the Vietnam War too. There was an American squadron which fought in there, even a French regiment that fought in Rhodesia too. It was a well-structured force. We have the Rhodesian Air Force, we have the British South Africa Police. This was a paramilitary unit. Its duties included the gathering of intelligence. We also have a group of special service soldiers called C Squadron. So the SAS, the Special Air Service, we had a group called the Sulu Scouts. Their job was to go out into the bush, the countryside, to track down terrorists, as they called them, or tears, as they called them. There were the Rhodesian African Rifles. Now, this was a regiment made up of both black and white soldiers. The Rhodesian Regiment, which was the longest standing regiment in Rhodesia and contained up to 8 battalions. And then we have an infantry unit called the Rhodesian Light Infantry, RLI. And the reason I'm mentioning the RLL last is that these were the soldiers that would be used in a series of innovative tactics which were put together by Rhodesian military planners. And one of the most innovative was what we call fire force operations. Now, before we move on to describing these fire force operations, let's just think about the strategy that was put in place. Well, first of all, with Rhodesia covering more than 400,000 square kilometers, it is obvious that we could not have, or you could not have a centralized force. So what you would have is different bases spread all around the country, operational bases, from which different forces could operate depending on their missions. So you had a lot of bases which were obviously around the border areas of Mozambique, of Zambia, etc. They were there to intercept terrorists coming over the border. Sea Squadron SAS would make incursions into Mozambique as well, which they did very successfully to try and destroy Zanla and Zebra bases. But we'll come to this fire force operation. Now, what happened was once an operational response or assault was required in a certain area, as I said, the insurgents didn't generally attack the enemy head on. What they would do is they would try and attack military outposts or make small scale attacks, mainly consisting of ambushes, etc. Usually there would be about 6 to 12 who would operate in a particular area. Once this enemy activity had been detected either by observation posts, British South African police were involved in this, Salute scouts, of course, were involved in these intelligence operations. So once this was detected, the operational command would call in what we call a fire force operation. Now, as we can see from the photo, this involved Alouette helicopters, and it involved a number of troops. Now, what usually happens was you would have one helicopter, which would be called the K car. This would carry the commanding commanding officer of the operation. His job would be to fly around the zone in order to recce, that is to survey the landing zone or the area to see where the dangers were, to see where was the best place for the G cars to land. And the G cars carried what we call sticks of men. They were squads, if you like. Stick is another name for squad of 4 men who would land in the area. The objective was to encircle an enemy force so as they could not escape. So first of all, the K car or the G cars would have made passes overhead. They would have used rifles. They would have used cannons, machine guns to clear the area. But once they landed and sealed off the area, there would then be a second phase where paratroopers would be dropped by C-47 Dakota, for example. 16 paratroopers, they would land and they would make a sweep of the area, and their objective was either to kill the enemy or to capture them. Once, though, the enemy was overcome, people were captured, they would be handed over to intelligence services like the British South Africa Police for questioning. The fire force would then to return to its its base of operations and await the next mission. Now, the story of Rhodesia doesn't end from a military point of view. That is that Rhodesian forces weren't defeated in any military way. In fact, what happened was the international pressure meant that they were forced to accept black minority rule. Rhodesia became Zimbabwe in 1980. But we are not here really to talk about Rhodesia and look at the regimes. What we are looking at in particular is the importance of the Alouette 3 in the evolution of irregular warfare and the way that it was fought. Now, again, we have to understand that helicopter warfare at the time, in the 1950s, that is, was a relatively new concept. This was when methods of irregular warfare, counterinsurgencies, were still being studied, were still being developed. And what military planners managed to do in the end was they managed to understand what the importance was of helicopters, how importantly they could be used, as opposed to conventional forces. Now, the interesting aspect about the helicopter is that it could be used in unison with other airborne forces, other aircraft, other aviation. And the purpose of this presentation is to really to underline the importance of the Alouette 3 in this development. If the forces still had to rely on helicopters using radial engines, for example, things might not have been the same. The conditions in Africa were very different to those that we find in Europe, so it's a much hotter climate, sound can get into the engines, etc. And in part, these problems were overcome by the use of a gas turbine engine. Now, we've spoken about military, but also obviously the Alouette 3 can be found still in a variety of countries, serving a variety of purposes. As for Charles-Marchetti and René Mouille, they are no longer with us, but they have a certain legacy. What this legacy is, again, is to provide us with the first turbo-powered helicopter, and also through the fact that they made a significant contribution to the aviation industry as a whole. In particular, they have made, in part, Airbus what it is today, and that is one of the world's leading manufacturers of military and civil helicopters. Well, there we are, everyone. That was just a short presentation of the Alouette 3. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to seeing you again when I will probably be talking about in more detail about the Congo Crisis, and also in French. So see you soon, everyone. Bye-bye.
This video is now ended. Please let your questions or remarks in comments. We will be glad to answer them. Like, subscribe and share to help us making the channel well known. See you soon.